The woods behind the old farmhouse were unnaturally still that evening, as if holding their breath for Claire's arrival. The path leading to her grandmother's cabin was half swallowed by moss and roots, the kind of silence that felt alive pressing against her ears. She hadn't been back since childhood, but the air carried the same damp sweetness she remembered, decay mingling with the faint scent of lilacs that should have died out long ago. When she unlocked the door, the hinges groaned like a warning. Inside, dust motes hung suspended in the beam of her flashlight, turning every movement into a ghostly flicker. She came only to gather a few things before selling the land, or so she told herself. But as she pried up the warped floorboard beneath the window, the smell of old cedar rose with something sour beneath it. The small wooden box she found there was no bigger than a loaf of bread, bound with a strip of cloth so brittle it crumbled at her touch. Inside were letters written in looping ink, the paper yellowed and fragile. The first line made her stomach tighten. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone. And I pray he never finds me." Outside, wind hissed through the trees, brushing against the cabin walls like restless fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow screamed into the twilight. Claire read on, her hands trembling as she recognized the name at the bottom of the page, Evelyn Carter, her great-aunt, the one no one ever spoke about. The woman who, according to family whispers, disappeared the night before her wedding. Claire leaned back, the floor creaking under her weight, unaware that by unsealing that box, she had awakened something the woods had been trying to forget for nearly 70 years. Claire had not planned to linger when she arrived at the secluded property hidden deep within the Ozark woods. Her grandmother's death had left her the old cabin, a place more shadow than memory, but she only wanted to collect a few keepsakes and sell the land. The drive there was long and winding, the kind that seemed to peel her away from the rest of the world. The trees pressed close on either side of the narrow dirt road, their branches heavy and interlocked above her car like a canopy meant to keep secrets in rather than the light out. When she stepped outside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic, as if the land itself remembered what had been buried there. The cabin stood crooked and gray, the wood eaten by time and silence. She hesitated before unlocking the door, her reflection in the cracked window distorted, almost unfamiliar, as if the house itself were studying her. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Her flashlight cut through the dark to reveal the remains of another life, a faded armchair draped with a moth-eaten quilt, a teacup turned upside down on the floor, and a family portrait whose faces had almost vanished beneath a thin film of dust. Each step she took stirred the quiet, floorboards groaning as though the house objected to being disturbed after so many years. She began to move through the rooms, opening drawers, sifting through old papers, her curiosity building despite herself. Near the window at the back of the room, she noticed a floorboard slightly raised, the edges darker than the rest as though something beneath had absorbed the moisture differently. On instinct, she fetched a small crowbar from her car and pried it loose. The smell that rose from beneath the floor was sharp and strange, the scent of cedar mixed with decay. A small wooden box lay buried in the dust, its corners darkened with age. The lid was tied shut with a strip of cloth that disintegrated when she touched it, leaving only brittle threads across her fingers. Her breath came shallow as she lifted the lid. Inside, carefully folded, were several letters tied together with faded ribbon, their edges eaten by time. Beneath them was a photograph so old it had begun to blur, showing a woman standing in front of the very same cabin, her expression unreadable. The handwriting on the first envelope stopped Claire cold. It was delicate, precise, and familiar in a way that made her heart thud against her ribs. She read the name written there and realized it belonged to someone she had heard only in whispers, a woman her grandmother never spoke of but whose absence had always haunted the family like an unanswered question. Claire sat on the dusty wooden floor, the box open beside her, moonlight slanting through the window and touching the stack of fragile letters with a silvery glow. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the first one, the paper so delicate it felt alive beneath her skin. The ink had faded to a deep brown, but the handwriting was elegant and deliberate, looping across the page in long, careful strokes. It began with a tone of quiet desperation, the voice of someone who had no one else to confide in. Evelyn's words painted a picture of a young woman trapped within the walls of her own bloodline, writing not to seek help but to leave a record of what could no longer be said aloud. The letters were dated from the late 1940s, each one unfolding a story that had been buried beneath generations of silence. As Claire read deeper, she felt the air around her grow heavier, as if the cabin itself was listening. Evelyn described the isolation of growing up in that same house, surrounded by family but suffocated by their rules. Her tone shifted between affection and fear, as though love and dread had learned to coexist. She wrote of a man, her cousin, whose name was mentioned only once but whose presence lingered between every line. He was older, confident, admired by the family, and chosen to inherit both the land and the name. The letters revealed how the family had arranged an engagement between them, not out of love but tradition, an unspoken pact to keep their lineage untainted. The words carried the weight of something darker than duty, as though Evelyn knew her refusal would come at a terrible price. Claire turned page after page, feeling her pulse quicken with each confession. The ink bled in places where tears or rain had fallen, blurring sentences that spoke of fear, confinement, and a growing resolve. One letter described how Evelyn began to hear whispers through the walls, how the woods outside seemed to echo with voices she could not name. The final paragraph of that letter was smeared, but Claire could make out the line, "I would rather vanish into the earth than let him claim me." She leaned back, the words ringing in her mind like a warning meant for her across time. The letters were more than words, they were a testimony, a cry for freedom that had never reached its destination. And as Claire placed the letter aside, she realized that by finding them, she had become part of the story Evelyn had tried so hard to hide. The more Claire read, the more she understood that Evelyn's life had not been shaped by love but by obligation disguised as tradition. The letters unfolded like confessions trapped in time, written by a woman cornered by the people who claimed to protect her. The engagement Evelyn described was not a union of hearts but an arrangement rooted in generations of secrecy. Her cousin, Thomas, was a man the family praised for his composure, his charm, and his commitment to the family name, but between Evelyn's lines, he emerged as something far more unsettling. His kindness was calculated, his affection rehearsed, and his interest in Evelyn seemed less like love and more like possession. He often visited her unannounced, lingering too close, his words veiled in politeness that carried an edge she could never quite name. She wrote that whenever she tried to speak against the marriage, her mother's face would harden with fear, not anger, as though even the thought of refusal was a danger that could not be spoken aloud. In one of the letters, Evelyn described a dinner where the engagement was formally declared. The family gathered around the table, candlelight flickering across solemn faces. No one asked her consent, it was treated as a decision already made, an inevitability. The air had felt heavy that night, and she wrote that she could almost hear the woods pressing against the windows, whispering her name as if trying to pull her away. Her cousin raised his glass to toast their future, his smile perfectly still, his hand tightening over hers until she could feel the bones grind beneath his grip. That single image haunted Claire as she read, imagining Evelyn sitting there, silent, surrounded by approval she could not escape. Evelyn's writing grew more desperate with each letter, the tone shifting from compliance to defiance. She described how her cousin began to visit her late in the evenings under the pretense of discussing their future. She wrote of the way he spoke about her body, her duty, the children they would have, all while calling it destiny. The more he spoke, the more she began to see the family's true nature, an insular world where control was disguised as loyalty, and obedience was mistaken for love. In the final letter of that sequence, Evelyn's handwriting faltered, uneven and rushed, as she confessed that she had begun to plan a way out. She didn't yet know how she would do it, only that she would rather die on her own terms than live as a possession in a legacy built on silence and blood. When Claire reached the next set of letters, something shifted in their tone. The fear that had saturated Evelyn's words began to transform into a quiet, deliberate calm, as if she had crossed a threshold inside herself and accepted what needed to be done. Among the folded pages lay a single sheet that was different from the rest, thicker, darker, and covered in symbols rather than sentences. It took Claire a moment to realize it wasn't a letter at all but a coded recipe. The handwriting was Evelyn's, though it looked hurried, as if she had written it in secret. At first glance, the recipe seemed to describe a tonic made from wild plants and herbs found near the property, nightshade, foxglove, water hemlock, and another name that had been scratched out so violently the paper tore. The ingredients were familiar to anyone who knew the local flora, but Claire's unease deepened as she recalled how deadly each one could be if prepared the wrong, or rather, the right, way. Evelyn's following letter confirmed Claire's suspicion. The recipe was not meant to heal but to harm. Evelyn described wandering through the woods late at night, gathering plants under the moonlight so no one would see her. She mentioned the strange sense of peace that came with it, as if the forest itself understood her purpose and guided her hand. She wrote of an old book she had found in her grandmother's chest, a collection of remedies and purifications, passed down through generations of women in the family, knowledge the men never knew existed. Hidden within those pages were instructions that could be interpreted as both medicine and weapon, depending on intent. Evelyn's tone in those letters became methodical, almost detached. She tested mixtures in small amounts, noting how each reacted, how the air changed when the liquid darkened to a certain shade. The coded recipe began to read less like science and more like ritual. Phrases such as, "Let the roots weep beneath the moon," and "Stir until the breath of night grows still," suggested that Evelyn was not just creating a poison but performing an act of reclamation. She was taking back the control that her family, and especially her cousin, had stripped from her. Claire imagined her ancestor alone in the dark, her hands stained with soil and sap, her heartbeat steady as she prepared the thing that would decide her fate. The letters ended abruptly after that, leaving Claire staring at the cryptic recipe, the scent of damp earth seeping through the cabin walls. It felt as though Evelyn had not just written instructions for herself but left behind a warning, or perhaps a promise, that what began in those woods was never meant to stay buried. The photograph lay beneath the final letter of that bundle, its surface worn and cracked at the corners, the image barely clinging to the fading paper. Claire held it up to the weak light filtering through the dusty window, her breath catching as the faces came into focus. Evelyn stood in front of the cabin, dressed in a modest pale gown, her expression a perfect stillness that felt unnatural the longer Claire looked. Beside her stood Thomas, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder, fingers digging slightly into her sleeve as if claiming her even in the stillness of a photograph. His face was the most disturbing part, not because it was cruel or monstrous, but because it wasn't. His smile was wide, practiced, and hollow, his eyes gleaming with the same false charm Evelyn had described in her letters. There was something in his gaze that seemed to follow her no matter how she turned the photo, a stare that pierced through the decades as though aware of being watched. Behind them, the woods loomed darker than they should have been, the tree-line casting long shadows that swallowed the edge of the frame. Claire couldn't tell if it was the way the light had hit the old film or something else entirely, but it looked as if the trees were leaning closer, their outlines twisted into almost human shapes. She brushed a fingertip across Evelyn's face, tracing the ghostly curve of her jaw, and a chill spread through her chest. There was no joy in her eyes, no trace of the woman who once laughed in the earlier letters. Evelyn's posture was stiff, her hands clasped in front of her as though she were bracing herself for something inevitable. The faint smudge near the hem of her dress caught Claire's attention. It could have been a shadow, but it looked darker, thicker, like dried earth or something more sinister. Claire turned the photograph over and found faint pencil marks on the back, a date, June 14, 1949, and a single word written in small, uncertain letters, "Soon." That word sank into her mind like a whisper from the past. The air in the cabin grew heavier as she studied the photo again, an uneasy awareness settling over her that she was not merely looking at history but standing inside it. The photograph was proof of something Evelyn had endured, something she might have anticipated with a calm born of despair. It wasn't just a keepsake, it was a silent witness, capturing the last image of a woman who knew she would never live to see her own wedding day. And though decades had passed, the haunted stillness of Evelyn's eyes seemed to demand that someone, at last, see the truth hidden in that moment frozen beneath Thomas's smiling hand. The first night Claire spent in the cabin after uncovering the letters and the photograph was thick with unease, the kind that pressed against her ribs and refused to let her rest. The forest outside was unnaturally quiet, save for the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. She lay on the old couch wrapped in her grandmother's faded quilt, trying to convince herself that the sounds she heard were only the natural murmurs of an old house. But as the clock neared midnight, the air seemed to change, the stillness sharpening into something almost sentient. A faint rustling began near the back wall, followed by a whisper so soft it might have been the wind, yet it carried the cadence of words she couldn't quite make out. Claire sat up, her heart thudding, straining to listen. The whisper stopped the moment she moved, as if the presence behind them had gone still too, waiting. The smell came next, a strange sweetness that drifted through the air, delicate but wrong, like flowers left too long in water. It clung to the back of her throat, both comforting and suffocating at once. She recognized it without knowing why. It was the same scent that had lingered on Evelyn's letters, faint but distinct, as if whatever had been used to write them had soaked into the paper and refused to fade. Claire followed the scent to the kitchen, where the old glass jars still lined the shelves. One jar, coated with dust, had been moved slightly out of place. When she lifted it, she found dried leaves and petals inside, the same plants mentioned in Evelyn's coded recipe. The odor intensified, sickly sweet and bitter beneath. She quickly replaced the jar, her hands trembling, unsure whether she had disturbed something best left untouched. That night, the whispers returned. They were clearer this time, faintly rhythmic, like a lullaby sung from the far side of a wall. Claire couldn't tell if the words were her own name or something else entirely, but the sound carried through the cabin's wooden bones, threading through every creak and sigh. The smell grew stronger again, filling the room until her eyes watered. When she opened the window to escape it, the wind that entered was colder than it should have been, carrying the scent of soil after rain and something metallic beneath it. She stood there for a long time, staring into the dark trees that surrounded the house, certain she could see movement between them, the suggestion of a figure watching. For the first time, she understood what Evelyn meant when she wrote that the woods whispered back. In that silence between the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of the night, Claire felt the house and the forest breathing together, alive with secrets that refused to sleep. The following morning, the air outside was still heavy with mist, curling through the trees like breath from something unseen. Claire needed distance from the suffocating stillness of the cabin, so she followed the faint trail that wound behind it toward the river. The woods were dense and uneven, the ground soft with years of fallen leaves and rot. Her boots sank slightly into the earth with every step, and though the sun had begun to rise, its light barely touched the forest floor. She felt watched, but not in the ordinary sense. It was as if the woods themselves recognized her presence, remembering the footsteps of someone who had once walked the same path long ago. The trail narrowed as she neared the sound of running water, and she could smell the damp mineral scent of the river before she saw it. The current was slow, almost stagnant, a mirror of dark green that seemed to swallow the light whole. As she crouched near the edge, something metallic glinted beneath the surface. She hesitated before reaching down, her reflection trembling in the murky water. When her fingers brushed against the object, the coldness of it startled her. It was smooth and small, caught between stones. She pulled it free and wiped away the river silt, revealing a tarnished silver locket. The hinges were stiff, the engraving faint with age, but when she turned it toward the light, she could just make out two initials entwined, EC and TM. Her stomach clenched as recognition struck. The same letters appeared in Evelyn's letters, and she knew at once what she was holding. The locket was a symbol of that cursed engagement, a token of love from Thomas that Evelyn must have carried until the end. When she forced it open, one side held a tiny photograph of Evelyn, her expression serene but wary, the same haunted eyes that stared from the larger picture in the cabin. The other side was empty except for a faint brownish stain at its edge, too dark to be rust. The sight of it made her chest tighten, a chill crawling up her spine. She realized the river may not have merely hidden the locket but guarded it, preserving what the family had tried to erase. As she stood, the water rippled though there was no wind, the movement forming small concentric waves that spread outward, disturbing the reflection of the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw another face beside her own in the surface, pale, indistinct, and watching. The air grew colder, and the woods fell silent again, as if they knew she had found something that was never meant to resurface. Claire returned to the cabin that evening to find a car she didn't recognize parked near the overgrown path. The sight of it made her pulse quicken, though she told herself it might belong to a neighbor or a surveyor. But Northwest One lived close enough for that to make sense. The air had cooled, dusk settling low across the trees when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned sharply, the fading light glinting off the metal buckle of a worn leather belt as a man emerged from the shadows. He was tall, his face lean and lined with years, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. When he spoke her name, his voice cracked with something between disbelief and regret. It took her a moment to realize who he was, her Uncle Raymond, the relative who had disappeared from the family decades ago and whose name had been erased from conversations as though he'd never existed. He said he'd seen her car from the main road and knew what she must have found. His gaze drifted to the cabin with a heaviness that suggested memory rather than curiosity. Claire invited him inside, though every instinct told her not to. The moment they stepped in, his expression changed. He looked around the dim room as though it were haunted, his jaw tightening when his eyes landed on the open box and the spread of Evelyn's letters on the table. He sat down slowly, the floor creaking beneath his boots, and for a long moment said nothing. When he finally spoke, his words came out low, almost unwilling. He told her that Evelyn's death had always been called a tragedy, a suicide brought on by grief and frailty, but that no one ever found her body. The family buried an empty coffin, he said, because it was easier that way. Raymond admitted he'd been there the night she disappeared. He had heard the shouting, seen the light in the cabin windows go out suddenly, and found Thomas the next morning by the riverbank, soaked and trembling, claiming she had run off into the woods. The sheriff at the time accepted the story, and the family made sure it stayed buried. As he spoke, his voice cracked under the weight of what he'd carried for so long. He said he left soon after because he couldn't live with the lies that had grown like vines around their bloodline. Claire listened, unable to speak, the walls of the cabin seeming to close in around them. The letters, the photograph, the coded recipe, all of it now felt like pieces of a truth too large to contain. And when Raymond looked up at her with eyes full of guilt, she realized he wasn't just there to confess but to warn her that some secrets in their family didn't stay dead. They waited. Later that night, after her uncle left without saying where he was going, Claire sat alone by the table, the letters spread before her like fragments of a puzzle that refused to settle into place. The oil lamp flickered weakly, throwing shadows that twisted across the wooden walls. Her hand shook as she reached for the final envelope, the one that had been tucked deepest inside the box, as though meant to be found only after everything else was known. The paper was darker, stained in places where water, or tears, had seeped through. The ink was smudged but still legible, Evelyn's handwriting steadier than before, every line filled with the quiet certainty of someone who had made her decision. She wrote that the wedding was only days away and that Thomas had begun to visit her room at night to remind her of her duty. She described how his voice turned soft when he spoke of their future, but his eyes no longer held warmth, only ownership. The family had already prepared her dress, she said, white lace threaded with her mother's pearls, a symbol of purity that felt to her like a shroud. In this letter, Evelyn wrote not of fear but of resolve. She mentioned the coded recipe again, though this time she no longer referred to it as a cure or a test but simply as her choice. She said she had prepared a tea for the morning of her wedding, brewed from the plants she had gathered under the moonlight. She described the taste as bitter at first, then sweet, like freedom disguised as forgiveness. She didn't write of anger toward Thomas or even her parents. Instead, her words carried a strange compassion, as if she pitied them for their blindness, for the way they confused control with love. She wrote that the poison would end more than her suffering, it would end the cycle that had bound the family in silence for generations. As Claire read the final lines, her vision blurred. The last words were written with deliberate care, as though Evelyn wanted them to be read aloud one day, *, let them bury what they think they've lost. The truth will grow again when someone listens. Claire pressed the letter to her chest, feeling its fragile weight. She imagined Evelyn sitting at this same table decades ago, candlelight trembling across her face, her calm steady as the world she knew began to collapse. The poison wasn't only her escape, it was her final act of defiance, a refusal to let her body or her will be claimed by the family that had stolen everything else. The next morning, the fog clung to the ground in pale ribbons as Claire walked toward the back of the property, following a pull she couldn't explain. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of the river mixed with something older, something buried deep within the soil. She carried the final letter with her, the one that ended in Evelyn's haunting promise, and read it again as she moved through the trees. The letter mentioned an old oak, one that stood like a keeper of truth behind the cabin. Claire found it easily, the largest tree on the property, its trunk gnarled and split, its roots twisting through the earth like veins. The ground beneath it was uneven, and a faint depression caught her eye, as if the soil had once been disturbed and settled again. She knelt down, brushing away the layer of damp leaves, her fingers sinking into the cold dirt. Something inside her already knew what she would find. She fetched a rusted spade from the shed and began to dig, the sound of metal scraping against roots breaking the silence of the woods. Each movement felt heavier than the last, the earth resisting her as though protecting its secret. After what felt like hours, the blade struck something solid. Claire dropped to her knees, pushing the soil aside with her hands until a fragment of wood emerged, dark and decayed. It wasn't a coffin, but a small wooden chest, sealed shut with rusted hinges. Her breath caught as she pried it open. Inside, wrapped in fabric that had once been white, were fragments of bone so delicate they looked like they could crumble into dust at a touch. The cloth was embroidered with faint traces of lace, the same pattern she had seen in the photograph, the dress Evelyn had worn on what should have been her wedding day. Beside the remains was a small glass vial, half filled with a cloudy liquid, sealed with wax that had melted and hardened again. The smell that rose from it was faint but unmistakable, the same sickly sweetness that had haunted the cabin. Claire covered her mouth, her body trembling as realization settled over her. Evelyn hadn't been buried by the family, she had buried herself, choosing the roots of the oak as her grave, as if asking the forest to remember what the world had forgotten. As Claire knelt there, the wind rose through the trees, the sound low and mournful. For a moment, she thought she heard a voice in it, not pleading, not afraid, but calm, almost grateful. The soil beneath her seemed to hum with quiet life, and she understood then that the curse Evelyn tried to break had been waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it, to finally bring her story back into the light.